A clay tablet excavated from ancient Nineveh in the 1870s and now held in the British Museum describes a flood so total it covered every mountain visible from the Mesopotamian plain. One man survived. He built a boat to exact measurements given by a god of wisdom. He released birds to test the retreating water. He came to rest on a high peak. The flood lasted 6 days and 6 nights. What gives that tablet its particular weight is not the story itself, and it is that the same story, the warning, the vessel, the mountain, the birds, was being told at the same time by ancient peoples who had never seen the Tigris. That distance, not just geographical but linguistic, cultural and temporal, is where tonight's question quietly lives. Why do so many ancient cultures remember the same world-ending event, not approximately the same, not in the loose way that all peoples living near rivers remember floods? The same structural bones a warning delivered to one person, a vessel prepared before the water rose a specific mountain where it finally stopped a small group who survived to begin again. Tonight we will follow 3 traces of that question. The myths themselves in their original strangeness, the geological record building beneath them, and the scattered physical evidence that may or may not connect the two. We are not going to resolve the question tonight. Some of what we examine will remain exactly where we found it, in the grey space between evidence and interpretation, between memory and myth. That, it turns out, is the most honest place to look. The oldest surviving written version of the flood story predates Genesis by more than 1,000 years. Scholars call it the Epic of Gilgamesh, though the flood episode inside it is older still carried in oral form for generations before anyone pressed it into wet clay. The survivor's name in that version is Utnapishtim. He is warned not by a god of judgment, but by a god of wisdom, one who values knowledge above all else. His instructions are precise, exact cubits for the hull, 7 levels, a single door. The precision feels less like poetry and more like a record of something someone once actually built. That same precision appears in Hindu texts describing a flood survived by a man named Manu, warned by a fish that kept outgrowing every vessel he placed it in, from jar to river to open sea, until it revealed itself as divine. The Greek version gives us Deucalion, warned by Prometheus, sheltered in a chest set down on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, when the water finally pulled back. The Chinese accounts describe waters so vast and stubborn they required 13 years of labour to drain threatening, not just people but the order of the world itself. Different continents, different languages, different gods with different names and different temperaments, and yet the architecture of the story holds. A warning, a vessel, survival on high ground, the world given a second attempt. One detail tends to get passed over in the comparisons. Aboriginal Australians isolated from the rest of the world for somewhere between 40 and 50,000 years preserve flood stories that geologists have since tested against mapped seafloor data. In specific cases, those stories describe hills that are now islands and river mouths that are now deep channels. When researchers modelled post-Ice Age sea level rise and compared the results to the geographic details in those oral traditions, the correspondence was close enough to suggest something worth pausing on. Communities may have preserved accurate environmental memory across more than 300 generations, not as archive. As living series sung and retold until the coastline it described had been underwater for 10,000 years. If oral tradition can hold that kind of geological accuracy across such a span, it changes the way we listen to the other stories. The ones about fire that came from a sky which had never dropped fire before. The ones about darkness that lasted not days but seasons, cold descending, where cold had no reason to come. The ones about a serpent crossing the heavens, not a symbol invented for ceremony, but something witnessed unnamed and encoded in whatever language the witness had available. The geological record carries its own version of these events. Around 12,800 years ago, something interrupted a planetary warming trend that had been running steadily for thousands of years. The shift was rapid ice cores from Greenland, record it in their layering. Pollen records across North America and Europe show the sudden disappearance of temperate species replaced by cold-adapted tundra plants, almost overnight in geological terms. The period has a name, the Younger Dryas. What triggered it remains in some respects still open. Researchers have identified unusual concentrations in the sediment record at the Younger Dryas boundary nanoscopic diamonds, platinum, anomalies carbonized material consistent with fires burning across vast regions, simultaneously appearing at dozens of sites across 3 continents. These are the kinds of signatures associated with high-energy impacts. Whether a cosmic event initiated the cooling is debated. The debate, though, has not quieted. If anything, it has grown more detailed as more sites are examined. And below the surface of the ocean there are structures. Stepped platforms off the coast of Japan descending into water too deep to have been submerged recently. Rectilinear sonar patterns in the Gulf of Cambat. Genuine drowned settlements dated and confirmed off the coasts of Greece and Israel. Whatever stood along those old shorelines, whatever was built on land that the Ice Age kept above water for millennia, is now difficult to reach, expensive to survey, and largely unseen. We hold these traces lightly tonight. No single one of them closes the question. But together they outline a shape that ancient peoples without instruments or sediment cores may have been attempting to describe in the only medium that travels across time, without requiring anything more durable than memory story. So we follow the first trace back to its source, to the oldest versions of the flood, and to the specific, quietly strange details that keep arriving from directions that should not know one another. The tablet and the flood. In December of 1872, a curator at the British Museum named George Smith sat down at a workbench surrounded by broken clay fragments recovered from the ruins of ancient Nineveh in what is now northern Iraq. He'd spent months sorting through thousands of pieces, most no larger than a human hand, tracing the cuneiform script pressed into their surfaces with the patience of someone who understood that meaning hides in small things. Then he found something that made him stop. According to accounts later told by colleagues, he set down the tablet, rose from his chair, and began pacing the room in a state that those present described as barely contained agitation. What he had just read was a flood story, not the flood story he already knew from biblical scripture, but one older, written in a language that predated Hebrew by centuries, describing the same essential sequence of events, with a precision that felt less like mythology and more like a record carefully maintained by someone who had been present. The tablet belonged to the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Mesopotamian text whose oldest surviving fragments date to around 2100 BC, thus the oral tradition behind it is almost certainly older still. The flood episode is narrated by a man named Utnapishtim, who sits across from the wandering king Gilgamesh, and recounts in methodical detail how the world as he knew it ended, and how he alone survived it. A god named Enki, the god of wisdom, of deep water, of craft and hidden knowledge, came to him not in a blaze of divine light, but through the thin wall of a reed house. He whispered. He told Utnapishtim to abandon everything he owned, to build a vessel of specific dimensions, and to take aboard the seed of all living things. The vessel was to be equal in all its measurements, 120 cubits on each side, 6 decks, a single door. That precision, the geometry, the specificity of the instruction is the first detail in this story that quietly refuses to behave like ordinary mythology. Flood narratives can emerge anywhere that people live near water, and that is nearly everywhere. Communities along rivers and coastlines need no ancient catastrophe to imagine the ground disappearing beneath rising tides. What they do not typically do is encode the warning in cubits, assign it 6 specific decks, and attribute it to the god of wisdom, delivering a message through a wall rather than from the sky. Those details carry a different quality. They feel less like the products of religious imagination and more like something preserved the way a formula is preserved with deliberate care, the numbers kept intact across generations, because someone once said, "Do not change this part." And that is where the quiet problem begins, because the same structural precision appears in accounts that have no known pathway of contact with Mesopotamia. The flood in the Gilgamesh text lasted 6 days and 6 nights. On the 7th the storm quieted, and the vessel came to rest on a mountain called Nisir. Utnapishtim waited in stillness, then sent out a dove, which returned finding no place to land. He sent a swallow, which also came back. Finally he released a raven, which did not return, and from that single absence he understood that dry land had emerged somewhere beyond the horizon. He opened the vessel, he made an offering on the mountaintop burning cedar and myrtle, and the gods gathered around the rising smoke like flies, the text says, because they were hungry. They had not anticipated how much they would miss the offerings of the living. That image, gods humble, drawn to a survivor's fire like common insects, is strange enough to suggest it was not invented by a priest seeking to flatter a divine court. It reads like something preserved despite its unflattering quality, and that is often how genuine memory survives. The censure is the uncomfortable detail that no editor thought important enough to remove. The biblical account of Noah follows the same sequence closely enough that scholars have debated for well over a century whether the authors of Genesis had direct access to Mesopotamian sources, perhaps during the Babylonian exile, when Hebrew communities lived for generations inside the same cultural landscape that produced Gilgamesh. That argument is reasonable as far as it goes. Two neighbouring literary traditions can share narratives, the way neighbouring villages share recipes. Something passes between them. Something is adapted and the underlying structure persists. But the argument has a geographic boundary. It explains the relationship between two stories from one corner of the ancient world, or it does not explain why the same structural skeleton warning, delivered to a chosen individual vessel prepared before the water rises refuge found on high ground, bird sent to test the retreating flood, offering made upon survival appears in ancient India, in ancient Greece, in the oral traditions of peoples who had no contact with Mesopotamia, or with each other for thousands of years. The motif of the birds in particular is a detail that keeps surfacing in places it has no obvious reason to appear. In the Greek account of Deucalion warned by Prometheus, and sheltered in a floating chest, the flood recedes and the survivors emerge on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. In several Native American flood traditions, birds are sent from a vessel or a raft to search for ground the water has not yet covered. The bird as scout is an operational detail procedural rather than poetic, the kind of specific step that tends to disappear as stories travel long distances and are retold across generations. Broad emotional arcs survive the terror of rising water, the gratitude of survival. Specific practical procedures usually do not make the journey. The persistence of this particular detail across cultures that should have no connection to one another suggests it may have been treated at some point in the deep past as a piece of information too important to leave behind. What that importance was, whether it points toward a shared literary ancestor, a shared catastrophe, or something stranger still, is what the chapters ahead will try carefully and without settled conclusion to trace. The tablet George Smith held in 1872 was only one entrance into a pattern far larger than any single culture could have generated alone, and the further we follow it, the less it resembles coincidence. The fish, the chest, and the 13-year water. A small clay figurine recovered from the Indus Valley and now housed in a museum in Karachi depicts a fish with unusual proportions, its body elongated, its mouth open, its fins spread as though it is moving through something thicker than water. Scholars classify it as ritual in function connected to a tradition of fish veneration that runs deep through ancient South Asian culture. What makes it worth holding in mind tonight is that the fish in Hindu cosmological memory is not simply a sacred animal. It is a messenger. It is the first form taken by a god who came to warn a man that everything he knew was about to be erased. The story of Manu and the fish appears in texts dating back at least 3,000 years, though the oral tradition behind it is almost certainly older, carried through generations before anyone thought to write it down. Manu, whose name means something close to man or thinker, finds a small fish in the water he uses for ritual watching. The fish speaks to him. It asks for his protection, explaining that in the ocean the large devour the small and that it needs shelter if it is to survive. Manu places the fish in a jar. The fish grows. He moves it to a larger vessel. It grows again. He transfers it to a river, then to the sea, and each time the fish outgrows whatever space he provides for it, a detail that has the quality of a teaching embedded inside a narrative, a reminder that the thing being described refuses to be contained by ordinary categories. Eventually the fish reveals itself as Vishnu, one of the sustaining forces of the cosmos, and delivers the warning that a great flood will soon consume the earth. Manu is told to build a boat and to take aboard seeds of every plant and pairs of every creature. He does so. The flood comes. Everything else is lost. What the Manu story shares with the Gilgamesh account is not just the broad shape of survival, the warning, the vessel, the flood, the aftermath, but the specific quality of the warning itself. In both accounts, the message does not arrive through spectacle. It arrives quietly through an intermediary that Manu treats with care before he knows what it is. The god of wisdom whispers through a wall in Mesopotamia. The god of preservation speaks through a fish small enough to fit in a washing jar in ancient India. The pattern of the quiet, unexpected messenger, someone or something that does not announce itself as divine, recurs with enough consistency across traditions to warrant attention, even if we hold it loosely and without conclusion. Across the Aegean, the Greek version of the flood story arranges itself around a man named Deucalion, son of Prometheus the Titan, who gave fire to humanity, and whose name means something close to forethought. The choice of messenger here is not incidental. The god associated with foresight warns his descendant about a coming destruction, and in that framing the story carries its own internal logic about the nature of survival. The righteous or the clever do not survive because they are lucky. They survive because someone who could see further than ordinary vision passed the knowledge on in time. Deucalion builds a chest, not a ship in the Gilgamesh sense, not a multi-decked vessel with precise measurements, but a sealed container, large enough to shelter him and his wife Pyrrha. And when the rains come and the world fills with water, they float inside it for 9 days and 9 nights before the chest comes to rest on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. 9 days. The number is different from the 6 of Gilgamesh, different again from the 40 of Genesis, but the underlying structure is the same, a defined period of catastrophe followed by a slow, uncertain return of the world. The detail that tends to be overlooked in discussions of Deucalion is what happens immediately after the flood recedes. The two survivors emerge onto a transformed landscape, silent and emptied of everything they had known. And the first thing they do is seek guidance from an oracle about how to repopulate the earth. They are told to throw the bones of their mother over their shoulders. They interpret this as referring to the stones of the earth, bones of the Great Mother, and when they cast the rocks behind them, people begin to emerge from the ground. It is a strange image, the kind that resists rationalization, and its strangeness is perhaps the point. The world after the flood is not simply the old world with the water removed. It is a new world that requires an entirely new kind of human to inhabit it. The myth is describing a discontinuity, a break so complete that even the origin of people must begin again from the beginning. The Chinese accounts move in a different direction, and that difference is itself illuminating. In the flood narratives associated with the legendary Emperor Yao, there is no single chosen survivor, no vessel, no mountain of refuge. Instead, there is a hero named Gun, who attempts to stop the floodwaters by building dams and embankments and who fails, and then his son Yu, who succeeds not by containing the water, but by working with it, dredging channels, carving new paths for the flood to follow toward the sea. Yu labours for 13 years. He passes his own home 3 times during those years and does not stop to enter it. When the work is finally done and the land becomes habitable again, the flood is remembered not as a divine punishment or a cosmic reset, but as an engineering problem, immense civilization threatening but ultimately solvable by human effort applied with patience and intelligence. And yet the scale the texts describe is unmistakably global, in feeling waters that covered mountains, threats to all human life, a world reduced almost to nothing before the slow work of recovery could begin. 3 traditions, 3 continents, 3 versions of the same underlying event arranged around entirely different cultural values, and yet all 3 insisting on the same essential fact that the water came, that it was total, and that almost nothing survived it. The detail is not the same in each account, but the insistence is. What the ice remembers. In the summer of 1989, a drilling team working on the Greenland ice sheet extracted a core of compressed ice from a depth of more than 3,000 meters. The core had taken years to reach, and the ice at its deepest layers had been accumulating since before the last ice age, each year's snowfall pressing down on the year before it, trapping tiny bubbles of ancient atmosphere particles of volcanic dust. Microscopic traces of everything the wind had carried across the planet at the moment those layers formed. Reading an ice core is something like reading a diary kept by the Earth itself, each entry written in a language of chemistry and density rather than words, each page corresponding to a year or a decade or a century of atmospheric history. What the Greenland cores revealed about a period roughly 12,800 years ago was, by the standards of geological expectation, almost violent in its clarity. The record showed a shift. Not a gradual transition of the kind that uniformitarian geology had taught researchers to expect. The slow tilting of climate over thousands of years, change so incremental that no single human lifetime would register it, but something that appeared in the ice layers as an abrupt boundary, a line where one set of conditions ended and another began within what the chronology suggested was a matter of decades, possibly less. Temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped sharply. The warming trend that had been running steadily since the peak of the last ice age retreating glaciers and rising seas was interrupted and then reversed. The glaciers that had been pulling back began to advance again. Across North America and Europe, pollen records from lake sediments show the sudden disappearance of temperate plant species and their replacement by cold-adapted tundra vegetation, the kind of ecological shift that under normal circumstances would require centuries of gradual cooling to produce. It appeared in the record almost overnight. Geologists gave this period a name, the Younger Dryas, after a small Arctic wildflower, Dryas octopetala, whose pollen suddenly fills the sediment layers of that era across much of the northern world. The cold lasted approximately 1,200 years, then it ended just as abruptly and the warming resumed. The standard explanation for the Younger Dryas has long centered on ocean circulation. As the great ice sheets of the last glacial maximum melted, they released enormous quantities of cold fresh water into the North Atlantic. Fresh water is less dense than salt water, and a sudden influx of it could have disrupted the thermohaline circulation, the vast conveyor belt of ocean currents that distributes heat from the tropics toward the poles and keeps the northwestern Europe far warmer than its latitude would otherwise allow. Disrupt that circulation and you could plausibly trigger rapid cooling across the northern hemisphere. It is a coherent mechanism supported by modelling, and for several decades it served as the sufficient answer to the question of what caused the Younger Dryas. Then researchers began looking more carefully at what else was in the sediment layers at the boundary, and the answer started to become more complicated. Across dozens of sites in North America, Europe, and parts of Asia, the sediment layer corresponding to the Younger Dryas boundary contains materials that do not belong there under ordinary geological conditions. Nanoscopic diamonds so small they are measured in billionths of a metre, appear in concentrations far above background levels. These nanodiamonds form only under conditions of extreme pressure and heat, the kind generated by high-velocity cosmic impacts, or the superheated shock waves that follow them. They do not form in volcanic eruptions, in floods, or in the gradual processes of weathering and erosion. Alongside the nanodiamonds, researchers found shocked quartz grains of the mineral deformed in ways that require pressures orders of magnitude beyond anything geological surface processes can produce, as well as platinum anomalies similar in character to those found in the famous iridium layer that marks the mass extinction event 66 million years ago, when an asteroid impact ended the age of the non-avian dinosaurs. There was also a thin dark layer of carbonized material consistent with massive wildfires burning simultaneously across vast continental regions and microscopic magnetic spherules of the kind produced when rock or soil is vaporized by an impact and then re-solidifies as it falls back through the atmosphere. Each of these markers taken alone might be explained away. Together appearing in the same stratigraphic layer at sites that spread across 3 continents, they outline a pattern that a growing number of researchers argue is consistent with only one kind of event, a cosmic impact or a series of them of extraordinary scale. The hypothesis that emerged from this evidence in the early 2000s proposed that approximately 12,800 years ago the Earth passed through a field of fragments left by a disintegrating comet. Not a single body is striking a single location, but multiple pieces, some exploding in the atmosphere as airbursts, some reaching the ground distributed across the northern hemisphere, in a pattern that would explain both the geographic spread of the impact markers and the scale of the climatic disruption that followed. The energy released by such an event concentrated over the northern ice sheets could have vaporized enormous volumes of ice, almost instantaneously sending vast quantities of cold meltwater into the Atlantic in a far more sudden and violent pulse than gradual melting could produce, triggering the oceanic disruption that the Standard Model describes, but through a mechanism the Standard Model had not considered. It would also have ignited continental-scale wildfires, injected dust and aerosols into the upper atmosphere in quantities sufficient to reduce incoming sunlight for years, and sent tsunamis of unimaginable scale across ocean basins, whose shorelines were already under stress from rising seas. The detail is uncomfortable, but it refuses to go away. The hypothesis remains contested. Not all researchers accept the interpretation of the boundary markers, and the dating of specific impact sites continues to be debated in the literature. But the conversation has shifted in the decades since the evidence was first published, and the shift itself is significant because the geological record read carefully, and without the assumption that catastrophes belong only to the deep past, begins to sound like something the oldest stories have been describing all along. the shore that memory kept. Consider what it means to remember a coastline that has been underwater for 10,000 years, not to imagine it, not to reconstruct it from maps or satellite data, but to carry its shape in living memory, to know the name of a hill that is now an island, to describe a river mouth that is now a deep water channel, to point out across the ocean toward a place where your ancestors once hunted and fished, a place that no living eye has seen above the surface in more generations than any culture on Earth has been keeping written records. That kind of memory should not be possible. And yet the evidence that it exists preserved in the oral traditions of Aboriginal Australians with a fidelity that modern geology has been able to partially verify is one of the quietest and most unsettling findings to emerge from the intersection of anthropology and earth science in recent decades. The Australian continent has been inhabited for somewhere between 50 and 65,000 years, making Aboriginal Australians the custodians of the oldest continuous cultural traditions on the planet. During the peak of the last ice age, roughly 20,000 years ago, sea levels around Australia were more than 120 metres lower than they are today. The continental shelf, the shallow underwater plain that extends outward from the modern coastline before the seafloor drops away into deeper water, was dry land. Rivers that now empty into the ocean ran much farther across that exposed plain before reaching the sea. Bays that today hold salt water were once freshwater lakes or estuaries. The landscape that Aboriginal peoples inhabited for tens of thousands of years was in its coastal geography fundamentally different from the one that exists now, and the transformation from one to the other happened gradually over thousands of years as the ice sheets of the last glacial period melted and the oceans rose to fill the continental shelves of the world. What researchers working in the field of geomythology, the study of geological events preserved in oral and mythological tradition, began noticing in the early 21st century was that certain Aboriginal stories described specific features of the pre-inundation landscape with a geographic accuracy that could not be accounted for by chance or by general knowledge of coastal geography. Stories from communities in different parts of Australia described particular hills that these storytellers identified as places their ancestors could once walk to from the mainland, places that the rising sea eventually surrounded and cut off. When geologists mapped the submerged terrain around those locations using sonar and bathymetric data, they found that the hills in question had indeed been connected to the mainland by land bridges or shallow plains, and that the water depths surrounding them corresponded to sea levels from roughly 7 to 10,000 years ago. The stories and the sea floor matched, not approximately specifically in ways that required the oral tradition to have preserved accurate geographic information across a minimum of 300 generations of retelling. The method by which such precision is maintained across such spans of time is itself a subject of ongoing study, and the answers that emerge from that study are not simple. Aboriginal oral traditions are not casual conversation. They are structured ceremonial bound by protocols of transmission that regulate who may tell which story tells, in what contexts, with what accompaniments of song and ritual. The story is not merely repeated, it is performed in a form that has been deliberately stabilized over time, the way a musical score stabilizes a composition against the drift of individual interpretation. The landscape itself often serves as a mnemonic anchor. The story is told in place with the physical features of the environment reinforcing the accuracy of the account, each landmark a cue that keeps the narrative from wandering. When the landmark disappears, when the hill becomes an island and the island is no longer visible from shore, the story must carry the geography entirely within itself, and it is in those cases perhaps that the accuracy of transmission becomes most remarkable and most difficult to explain by ordinary means. The implications extend beyond Australia, and that extension is where the pattern recurrence begins to demand attention. If oral tradition can maintain accurate environmental memory for 10,000 years under the right conditions of cultural care and ceremonial stabilization, then the question of what other kinds of information might have survived, similar spans of transmission, becomes genuinely open. The Aboriginal flood stories are not unique in their claim to geographical precision. They are simply the cases where modern science has had the tools and the opportunity to check the claim against independent evidence. Other traditions in other parts of the world make comparable assertions about landscape features that predate the rise of written civilization, and in at least some of those cases, the geological record offers suggestive, if not conclusive, corroboration. Pacific Islander traditions describing channels between islands that surveys confirm were above water during the Ice Age. Native American stories from coastal regions that appear to reference shoreline configurations consistent with lower sea levels. The pattern is not universal, and not every ancient landscape story survives verification. But the ones that do survive it suggest something worth carrying forward into the rest of this inquiry, that the human capacity for long-term memory, when it is treated as a survival necessity rather than a cultural accessory, may be considerably more durable than the modern assumption of oral unreliability has led us to expect. There is one detail embedded in the Australian research that tends not to make it into popular accounts of the findings. Several of the stories that geologists were able to partially verify describe not a gradual rise of the waters as slow generational encroachment that people might adapt to and eventually incorporate into normal experience, but something faster. A sudden advance. Water arriving with a speed that forced movement that transformed familiar landscape into unfamiliar sea within a time frame that living memory could register. Whether that reflects actual episodes of rapid inundation during the post-glacial sea level rise, or whether it reflects the compression that memory applies to processes that unfold over multiple generations remains uncertain. But the distinction matters because it touches the question of what exactly the flood stories are remembering, and whether the word flood in the oldest of those accounts means something more specific than we have generally assumed: fire from a sky that had never burned. The Book of Genesis describes the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in language that has troubled careful readers for centuries, not because of its moral framing, which fits comfortably within the theological architecture of the text, but because of its physical specificity. Burning sulfur falls from the sky. Dense smoke rises from the land like the smoke of a furnace. The ground itself becomes so intensely hot that Lot's wife, pausing to look back, is transformed into a pillar of salt, an image that some researchers reading it outside its devotional context have interpreted as a poetic encoding of instantaneous incineration, or the kind of mineral incrustation that extreme heat and pressure can produce in organic material. Whether that interpretation is correct is impossible to say with certainty. What is harder to dismiss is that the story describes fire arriving from above, not erupting from below, and that it describes this arrival as targeted, sudden, and total in its destruction of everything it touches. That distinction, fire from the sky rather than from the earth, recurs across ancient accounts with a consistency that resists easy categorization. Volcanic eruptions were known to ancient peoples. They lived near volcanoes, they watched them erupt, they recorded the experience in story and in ritual. Lightning was equally familiar, a constant presence in the seasonal life of every culture on Earth. Forest fires spread by wind across dry landscapes were part of the ecological reality of ancient life in ways that modern urban experience has largely obscured. None of these familiar phenomena, however, match the specific character of what the oldest accounts describe: fire that falls like rain, that comes from a direction the sky had never before produced, fire that burns in a way that ordinary fire does not burn, and that leaves behind a transformed landscape blackened, barren, and changed in ways that outlast the fire itself by years or generations. The detail is small by the standards of catastrophe, but it refuses to resolve into any of the available explanations. The Greek myth of Phaethon approaches the same event from a different angle, and its approach is worth taking seriously on its own terms before reaching for interpretation. Phaethon, son of the sun god Helios, persuades his father to let him drive the solar chariot across the sky for a single day. He cannot control the horses. The chariot veers off its course, plunges toward the earth, and the heat it carries scorches everything beneath it. Rivers dry up, forests ignite. Entire populations are burned across vast swaths of the landscape, and the earth itself cracks open from the intensity of the heat. Zeus finally intervenes, striking Phaethon down with a thunderbolt to stop the destruction, but by the time he does, the damage across whole regions of the world is described as permanent. What is unusual about the Phaethon story compared to most Greek mythological accounts of divine destruction is its scale and its specificity about physical consequence. It does not describe a local punishment or a targeted divine intervention. It describes a moving source of catastrophic heat crossing the sky, scorching the landscape in a path and leaving behind a transformed geography. Some historians of mythology have noted cautiously that this description has the quality of a witnessed event imperfectly understood, something that happened, and was then explained in the only available conceptual framework, which was the machinery of divine chariots and solar horses. And that is where the quiet problem reasserts itself. In the ancient Persian text known as the Bundahejan, one of the foundational scriptures of Zoroastrian cosmology, there are passages describing a cosmic fire that fell from above in the distant past. A conflagration that covered the earth, flowed as molten material across the landscape, boiled rivers and melted mountains before finally exhausting itself. The Zoroastrian framing places this within a cosmological narrative of purification and renewal, and that framing is genuinely its own, shaped by a theological tradition with its own internal logic. But the physical description, molten material flowing across the ground rivers, destroyed by heat mountains, altered by fire from above, is not easily derived from the metaphysics of purification alone. It reads like an attempt to describe something that had actually been seen or that had been passed down in sufficient detail to carry the texture of observation rather than invention. Move further to the Aztec account of the Fourth World Age, and the description becomes more precise still. In Aztec cosmological memory, each world age ends by a different mechanism: jaguars, wind, flood, fire, and the fourth of the age ends specifically in a rain of fire, actual flames descending from the sky in quantities sufficient to consume everything beneath them. The few survivors are described as hiding in caves, emerging afterward to find a landscape blackened and unrecognizable, the familiar world replaced by something that required years to become habitable again. The Aztec calendar stone, that massive carved disc, whose imagery is one of the most reproduced artifacts of pre-Columbian culture, includes among its symbolic registers depictions of this Fire Age flames descending from above while human figures flee below. The image is not metaphorical in its visual language. It depicts a directional event, something coming down from above, and it depicts the human response to it as flight and concealment rather than prayer or sacrifice. The Maya Popol Vuh describes an age ending in a rain of resin, a burning sticky substance falling from the sky in such quantities that it covers the earth and cannot be removed from what it touches, destroying the people of that age entirely. Modern translators have struggled with the passage because the substance described does not correspond to anything in the natural experience of tropical Mesoamerica. It behaves less like any known natural phenomenon, and more like something incendiary and adhesive falling in volume from above. That discomfort among translators is itself a small signal worth noting, because it suggests the description is not a conventional literary device, but something the original authors were attempting to communicate with unusual specificity. What the geological record offers in partial response to these accounts will occupy the chapters ahead, particularly the evidence accumulating around the Younger Dryas boundary, and what the distribution of impact markers across 3 continents may imply about what the sky was doing approximately 12,800 years ago. The case for coincidence. It is worth stepping back from the accumulation of pattern and allowing the strongest counter-arguments their full weight, because they are not trivial and they deserve to be held seriously rather than passed over quickly on the way to more comfortable conclusions. The case against interpreting ancient flood myths as the memories of a shared global catastrophe is not simply the reflexive skepticism of institutions protecting their established timelines. It rests on genuine observations about how human minds work, how stories travel, and what the archaeological record actually contains, and any honest engagement with the question we have been following requires spending time in that discomfort rather than moving past it. The first and perhaps most fundamental objection is psychological. Human beings everywhere share the same basic cognitive architecture, the same emotional registers, the same categories of fear. We live on a water-covered planet where flooding is among the most common and most destructive natural events available to human experience. Communities built near rivers, which is most ancient communities since rivers provided drinking water or irrigation and transport, would have experienced devastating floods within living memory in almost every generation. The psychological impacts of flood on a small subsistence-level community is not analogous to the impact of flood on a modern city with infrastructure and early warning systems. It is total. It erases homes, food stores, animals, elders, children, and the accumulated material of years in a matter of hours. It is from the perspective of the people experiencing at the end of the world, because their world, the particular web of relationships and resources that constituted their existence, has genuinely ended. Given this, the argument runs, it requires no shared catastrophe to explain why so many cultures independently develop myths of a world-ending flood. It requires only that they were human, living near water and capable of turning their worst experiences into cosmological narrative. The similarities between the stories reflect not a shared event, but a shared nervous system, and a shared tendency to reach for the largest available frame divine judgment. Cosmic reset the end and beginning of ages, when attempting to make sense of experiences that exceed ordinary comprehension. This argument is serious and it accounts for a great deal. It explains the emotional architecture of flood mythology convincingly. Where it begins to strain is against the specific operational details, the qubits, the decks, the sequence of birds, the particular mountains that appear in accounts from traditions that should have no pathway of influence between them. Psychological universals produce broadly similar emotional narratives. They do not typically produce identical procedural sequences in geographically isolated cultures. That gap between what the psychological argument explains and what it leaves unexplained is not itself proof of a shared event, but it is a space that the argument cannot comfortably fill. The second major objection is diffusion, and it is in some ways more technically sophisticated than the psychological account. Human populations have never been as isolated from one another as their geographic separation might suggest. Even in the deep past, bands migrated across vast distances, met at seasonal gathering sites, traded materials, and almost certainly traded stories. A powerful narrative once generated by a genuine local trauma can spread laterally through a network of contacts across a continent and eventually across multiple continents carried by the same migration routes that spread tool technologies and genetic lineages. Over thousands of years of retelling and adaptation, a story originating in one flood event in one region could arrive in cultures that have no memory of direct contact with its source, wearing different names and different gods, but carrying the same structural bones. In this model, the similarities between flood myths across cultures are evidence not of a shared catastrophe, but of a shared storytelling network whose connections are simply too old and too diffuse for us to trace directly in the historical record. Some researchers argue that the absence of evidence for those connections is not evidence of absence, that the connections existed, that they predate writing, and that the myths are the fossil record of a communication network we no longer have other means to reconstruct. This argument also carries real weight, and for certain pairs of traditions, the Mesopotamian and Hebrew, accounts for instance where direct cultural contact is historically documented, it is almost certainly the correct explanation, but it becomes progressively less comfortable as the geographic and temporal distances increase. The Aboriginal Australian traditions preserved their flood narratives across 50,000 years of isolation from the Eurasian landmass. The Native American traditions developed independently across at least 15,000 years of separation from the Old World. Invoking diffusion to explain convergences across those distances requires positing communication networks of extraordinary reach and durability networks for which we have essentially no independent evidence. It may be true, it cannot be demonstrated, and the honest position is to acknowledge that it explains some of the convergence while leaving a residue that it does not fully account for. The third objection concerns the physical evidence itself. The Younger Dryas' impacts are a hypothesis. Compelling, as its proponents find, it has been disputed by researchers who argued before that the boundary markers, the nanodiamonds, the platinum anomalies, the carbonized layer have been misidentified, contaminated, or inconsistently distributed across the sites where they appear. Some geologists maintain that the Younger Dryas cooling can be explained entirely by oceanic circulation changes without invoking any cosmic mechanism, and that the search for an impact signature reflects a prior commitment to catastrophism rather than a dispassionate reading of the data. These critiques are not fringe positions. They appear in peer-reviewed literature made by researchers with relevant expertise, and they have not been definitively answered. The debate is genuinely unresolved. It may be natural, it may be chance. The discomfort is that we cannot be sure, and that the pattern once seen across all these traditions and all this evidence does not quietly dissolve simply because each individual piece of it can be contested. The question is not whether any single trace is conclusive. The question is whether so many inconclusive traces pointing in the same direction from so many different starting points can be adequately explained by coincidence alone. What lies below the waterline? The seafloor off the southwestern coast of Japan descends in a series of broad flat terraces before dropping away into deeper water, and it is on one of those terraces at a depth of roughly 25 meters near the island of Yonaguni that divers into the mid-1980s began reporting something that the underwater geography of that region had no obvious reason to contain. The formations they described in the photographed stepped platforms cut at right angles, flat surfaces running in geometric lines, what appeared to be stairways ascending from one level to the next. Columns, standing at intervals that seemed too regular to be accidental, divided the research community in ways that have not fully resolved in the decades since. Marine geologists who examined the site pointed to the natural tendency of Yonaguni's sandstone to fracture along parallel planes, producing right-angle breaks and flat surfaces that can, under the right conditions of erosion and tectonic stress, assemble themselves into arrangements that strongly resemble deliberate construction. Others, including the Japanese geologist Masaki Kimura, who spent years diving the site, argued that certain features, the precision of specific cuts, the consistency of the angles, the presence of what appeared to be a road or pathway running along the base of the largest formation, exceeded what natural processes could reasonably be expected to produce. The site remains officially unclassified, suspended between natural wonder and potential artifact. And that suspension is itself a kind of evidence not of what happened, but of how much we do not yet know about what lies beneath the surface of the ocean that swallowed the coastlines of the Ice Age world. The reason the Yonaguni formations matter to the broader question is not that they conclusively demonstrate the existence of a pre-flood civilization. They do not, and claiming otherwise would misrepresent the state of the evidence. What they demonstrate is something more modest, but in some ways more significant, that the seafloor in regions that were above water during the last ice age contained structural anomalies that current science has not fully characterized, and that the resources devoted to characterizing them have been by any reasonable measure inadequate to the scale of the question. The continental shelves of the world, the shallow underwater plains that represent the coastlines and river deltas of the Ice Age world, cover an area comparable to the combined landmass of Africa and Europe. The portion of that area that has been systematically surveyed with the resolution required to identify human-scale structures is a small fraction of the total. Whatever was built along those coastlines in the millennia before the seas rose is for the most part still waiting to be looked at. In the Gulf of Kambat off the northwestern coast of India, sonar surveys conducted in the early 2000s returned images of what appeared to be rectilinear patterns on the seafloor, geometric arrangements that some researchers interpreted as the remains of urban layouts, streets and building foundations preserved beneath the sediment at depths consistent with submersion during the post-glacial sea level rise. Divers subsequently recovered artifacts from the area, including worked wood that was submitted for radiocarbon dating, and returned ages that, if accurate, would place human activity at the site during the period when the Gulf of Kambat was still dry land. The findings were reported in the Indian press and in conference proceedings, but they attracted relatively little sustained academic attention, partly because the dating of artifacts recovered from active underwater sediment environments is notoriously unreliable. River currents can carry objects far from their original context and deposit them in layers that post-date their manufacture by centuries, and partly because the interpretation of the sonar images as urban remains required a degree of inference that the images themselves could not definitively support. The honest assessment is that the Gulf of Kambat findings are suggestive without being conclusive, and that the difference between suggestive and conclusive is precisely what the limited survey resources available for underwater archaeology have thus far been insufficient to resolve. What the Mediterranean offers by contrast is something unambiguous. The submerged settlement of Atlit Yam, lying beneath roughly 10 meters of water off the northern coast of Israel, is not a disputed anomaly or an ambiguous sonar image. It is a documented Neolithic village excavated by marine archaeologists, containing stone-paved streets, the remains of rectangular dwellings, a well-ritual standing stones arranged in an oval, and the skeletal remains of its inhabitants, including 2 individuals whose bones show evidence of tuberculosis, making them among the oldest known cases of the disease in human history. The village was inhabited approximately 9,000 years ago, and was abandoned, the evidence suggests, as rising seas made it increasingly untenable before being finally submerged as the Mediterranean reached its current level. Atlit Yam does not require interpretation or inference. It is simply there preserved beneath the water, a complete snapshot of a community that built its home on land that the ocean subsequently claimed. And if one village of that scale and completeness survived at a depth of 10 meters, the question of what might survive at greater depths along the more extensively drowned continental shelves becomes considerably less hypothetical. The Greek site of Pavlopetri, submerged off the southern coast of the Peloponnese to a depth of 3 to 4 meters, offers a similarly concrete data point. It is the oldest known submerged town in the Mediterranean, with a town plan dating to approximately 5,000 years ago, including streets, building foundations, and what appears to be a cemetery. Its submersion is attributed not to sea level rise, but to localized land subsidence. But its existence confirms the same basic principle that Atlet Yam confirms that the boundary between land and sea has shifted, that human settlements have been caught in that shift, and that the ocean floor holds an archive of human occupation that is largely unread. What the oldest stories call the drowned world, the seafloor has been quietly preserving all along. The monuments that face the sky. One date sits in the archaeological record like a stone in a shoe, small enough to overlook and impossible to ignore once noticed. 11,500 years ago, before the first domesticated grain, before the earliest permanent settlements that standard chronology recognizes, before pottery, before the organizational complexity that archaeology has traditionally associated with monumental construction. Someone was quarrying limestone blocks weighing up to 20 tons on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, transporting them to a site on the ridge and setting them upright in carefully planned circular enclosures. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, and the people who built it left no written record of why they did so, no identifiable burial ground, no evidence of permanent habitation at the site itself. What they left were the pillars T-shaped, carved with animals and abstract symbols arranged in configurations that required sustained collective effort of a kind that standard models of Neolithic social organization did not predict and have not fully explained. The conventional narrative of how civilization develops runs in a particular sequence that has the reassuring quality of logical necessity. Hunter-gatherer bands settle, agriculture produces surplus, enables specialization. Specialization allows some members of the community to spend time on things other than food production, and eventually that liberated time produces priests and architects and monumental construction. Göbekli Tepe does not fit this sequence. The earliest radiocarbon dates for the site predate the emergence of agriculture in the surrounding region by at least 1,000 years, and the architectural sophistication of the oldest enclosures, which are strangely more elaborate than the later ones, as though the tradition was declining rather than developing. Over time implies organizational and technical capacities that the standard model assigns to a much later stage of social development. The archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who led excavations at the site for nearly 2 decades before his death in 2014, proposed that Göbekli Tepe inverts the expected sequence, rather than religion and ritual emerging. As a product of settled agricultural society, they may have preceded, and in some sense driven, the transition to settlement. The temple came first, the village followed. That inversion is significant not only for what it tells us about the specific site, but for what it suggests about the assumptions underlying the larger narrative that if the sequence can be inverted here, it may have been more variable elsewhere than the standard model has room to accommodate. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe carry carvings that have been the subject of sustained interpretive effort since the site was first excavated. Any of the animals depicted, foxes, snakes, wild boar, vultures, scorpions, cranes, have been connected to symbolic systems found in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, suggesting a shared iconographic vocabulary extending across a wider region than the site alone. But it is the abstract symbols, the H shapes, the crescents, the repeated geometric forms that appear on the pillars without obvious representational meaning that have attracted a more specific kind of attention from researchers interested in archaeoastronomy. Some analysts working from the orientation of the enclosures and the positioning of specific carved symbols have argued that the site was designed with astronomical alignments in mind, that certain pillars face specific points on the horizon that correspond to significant stellar risings or settings at the time of the site's construction. The argument is contested as such arguments usually are, but the pattern recurrence, the appearance of astronomical orientation as a design principle across ancient monumental sites in multiple parts of the world is too consistent to be dismissed without engagement. The Great Pyramid at Giza, built approximately 4,500 years ago, and already ancient by the time the Roman Empire existed, is aligned to the cardinal directions with a precision that modern surveyors have measured and found remarkable, an error of less than 1/20th of a degree. From true north achieved without magnetic compasses in a culture whose technical resources were limited to what could be accomplished with human labour, simple tools, and extraordinarily careful observation of the sky. The internal shafts of the Great Pyramid, narrow passages running at precise angles from the inner chambers toward the exterior of the structure, are aligned according to analysis conducted in the 1990s with specific stars that held cosmological significance in ancient Egyptian religion. Orion's belt, associated with the god Osiris, and Thuban, the pole star of the Pyramid Age. Whether these alignments were intentional or represent a coincidence produced by the general northward orientation of the structure is debated, but the level of astronomical awareness demonstrated by Egyptian builders in other documented contexts, their division of the night sky into decans, their tracking of heliacal risings, their calendar, calibrated to the Nile flood through observation of Sirius, makes intentional alignment a more parsimonious explanation than accidental correspondence. What unites Göbekli Tepe, the Giza complex, the megalithic alignments of Nabta Playa in the Sahara, predating Stonehenge by thousands of years, and oriented to the summer solstice with a precision that required systematic observation over generations, and the temple complexes of Angkor in Cambodia, whose layout has been argued to reflect the constellation Draco as it appeared in the sky around 10,500 years ago, is not any single claim about their builders or their purposes. It is a shared orientation toward the sky as something that required permanent encoded attention, something important enough to build into stone in ways that would outlast any individual, any dynasty, any civilization. The sky for the people who built these structures was not a backdrop. It was a clock, a calendar, a record of cycles long enough that no single human life could observe their full extent, and the monuments were, among other things, instruments for extending observation across time. The ages that ended before ours. A quiet observation sits at the centre of comparative mythology that tends to get flattened when the subject is discussed in popular contexts. The flood stories, the fire accounts, the darkness narratives, these are not simply stories about things that happened. They're in culture after culture, embedded within a larger framework that insists those things have happened before more than once and will happen again. The world that was destroyed was not the first world. The survivors who rebuilt it were not the first survivors. The age we inhabit now is one in a sequence, and the sequence, according to the traditions that preserved it most carefully, has a structure, a rhythm, almost a pattern of rise and collapse that repeats on timescales long enough to exceed any individual memory, but short enough in geological terms to be relevant to the question of what the Earth is capable of doing to the civilizations living on its surface. The Maya long count calendar is perhaps the most discussed example of ancient cyclical time-keeping, partly because its most recent major cycle boundary, December 2012, attracted the kind of popular attention that usually obscures more than it illuminates. But beneath the noise of apocalyptic speculation, the long count encodes something genuinely interesting. It is not primarily a countdown to catastrophe, it's a record of deep time. A system designed to place any given moment within a framework of cycles nested inside larger cycles, the way a clock face is nested within a calendar is nested within a century. The Maya were not unusual among ancient civilizations in conceiving of time. This way, they were unusual in the precision and the mathematical sophistication with which they did so, and in the extent to which that precision was directed toward the sky, specifically toward the movements of Venus, the behaviour of solar and lunar cycles, and the slow processional drift of the constellations along the horizon over periods of thousands of years. Their astronomers could predict eclipses centuries in advance. They tracked Venus with an accuracy that required generations of systematic observation recording the planet's synodic cycle, its apparent movement from morning star to evening star and back to a precision that modern measurement confirms is correct to within minutes over century-long spans. People who watch the sky that carefully for that long, and with that level of systematic care, are not engaged in aesthetic appreciation. They are monitoring something they believe requires monitoring. The Hindu conception of cyclical time operates on a scale that initially resists comprehension. The Kali Yuga alone, the current age of moral and cosmic decline in the Vedic framework, is calculated at 432,000 years, and the full Mahat Yuga cycle of which it is a part runs to 4.32 million years. These numbers are so large that it is tempting to treat them as purely symbolic, as the kind of numerical inflation that sacred mathematics sometimes employs to convey the idea of vastness rather than a specific duration. But within the Vedic tradition, the description of what happens at the end of each age is strikingly concrete: floods, fire, unusual behavior of the sun, the collapse of moral and social order, the near extinction of human life followed by a renewal, in which the survivors of the preceding age carry forward the essential knowledge into the next. The mechanism changes from age to age. The structure remains fixed, and embedded within that structure is an implicit claim that the people who formulated it believed they were not describing a hypothetical future but a recurring pattern they had observed or had inherited sufficient memory of to treat as reliable. The Hopi tradition of the American Southwest describes 3 worlds that existed before the current one, each destroyed by a different mechanism, each producing a small group of survivors who are guided into the next world by spiritual helpers carrying with them the responsibilities and the warnings that their predecessors had failed to honor. The first world ended in fire, the second ended in ice, the third ended in flood. In each case, the destruction came not as random catastrophe, but as a consequence of a specific kind of imbalance, a forgetting of essential relationships, a disruption of the pattern that holds the world in its proper form. The fourth world, the current one, is described as operating under the same conditions of fragility, subject to the same possibilities. The Hopi elders who maintain this tradition do not present it as allegory. They present it as history and as active prophecy, a description of what has already happened, and of what the structure of things makes possible again. The Aztec 5 Suns cosmology assigns a different elemental force to each world age, and a different catastrophe to each ending. Jaguars destroyed the first world. Hurricanes that turned people into monkeys ended the second. The third ended in fiery rain. The fourth ended in flood that transformed its survivors into fish. The current age, the 5th sun, is described as uniquely fragile, requiring active ritual maintenance to sustain the motion of the sun across the sky. Without that maintenance, the Aztec priests believed the 5th sun would fail as the others had failed, and the world would end by earthquake. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, the structure of the account preserves something consistent across all 5 ages, the pattern of flourishing and balance, catastrophe and renewal, each cycle complete in itself, each one leaving a residue of memory that the next stage inherits in partial and distorted form. The Greek tradition arranges its version of cyclical decline along a sequence of metals: gold, silver, bronze heroes, iron descending from an age of ease and abundance toward one of labour, injustice and moral entropy. Hesiod, who recorded this sequence in the 8th century BCE, writes with the resigned authority of someone who believes he already knows which age he inhabits, and how it compares to the ones that came before. The Golden Age is not mythological in the sense of being fabricated. It is described as real prior, and lost a world that actually existed before whatever series of disruptions separated it from the present. The decline is not metaphorical decline. It is the record, as Hesiod understood it, of a series of actual collapses, each one leaving humanity diminished and further from the original abundance. What all of these frameworks share is not the details of their cosmologies, but a structural insistence that carries the weight of something more than speculation. They insist, each in its own idiom, that the current world is not the original world, that something ended before more than once, and that the ending left marks in the landscape, in the sky, in the memory of the survivors that careful people encoded into their deepest and most durable stories to make certain the knowledge would survive whatever came next. The ones who remembered. In the Sumerian account of the flood, the detail that most resists assimilation into the standard reading of the myth is not the boat, not the measurements, not the birds. It is the identity of the god who delivers the warning. Enki, the deity who comes to Utnapishtim through the wall of the reed house and tells him what is coming, is not the god of justice or the god of judgment. He's the god of wisdom, of fresh water, of craft, of the deep knowledge that underlies all making. He is in the Sumerian conception of the divine, the one who holds the the fundamental principles of civilization, the tablets on which are recorded the knowledge of agriculture, of music, of writing, of law, of kingship, of the descent into the underworld and the return from it. When the flood comes, the God who ensures that one person survives is the God whose domain is the preservation of knowledge itself. That alignment between the survivor and the keeper of essential information is not incidental to the story. It appears to be its central organizing principle, and it appears in that role across cultures and traditions so consistently that it begins to look less like a narrative convention and more like a cultural memory of something that actually mattered. In the Hindu tradition, Manu, the man warned by Vishnu in the form of a fish, is not simply a righteous individual selected for survival on moral grounds. He is a lawgiver, the progenitor not only of humanity in the physical sense, but of the legal and ritual frameworks that organize human society. What he carries through the flood is not merely his life. What he carries is the knowledge of how to live the laws, the rights, the proper relationships between human beings and between human beings and the cosmos. The flood in the Manu narrative is not just a destruction of the people. It is a near destruction of the informational substrate that makes organized human existence possible, and the survival of Manu is specifically the survival of that substrate in the form of the man who holds it. The same logic operates in the biblical account of Noah, where God's instructions to Noah specify not only the dimensions of the ark, but the categories of life to be preserved within it, a floating archive of biological diversity, a seed bank against total erasure. The ark is in this reading less a boat than a library, and Noah is less a sailor than a librarian. The pattern extends beyond the flood narratives into the broader structure of how ancient civilizations organized the transmission of critical knowledge, and that extension is where the quiet problem becomes most interesting. Across multiple ancient cultures, there existed specialized roles: priests, shamans, daykeepers, rishis, druids, augurs whose primary function was not governance or warfare or agriculture, but the maintenance and transmission of a specific body of knowledge that was considered too important to be entrusted to ordinary memory or ordinary social transmission. In some traditions, this knowledge was explicitly astronomical: the movements of planets, the timing of eclipses, the slow processional drift of the constellations that unfolds over periods of 26,000 years and requires multi-generational observation to track accurately. In others, it included geographical knowledge, the locations of safe high ground of freshwater sources of routes that had carried people through previous catastrophes. In still others, it encompassed what might be called cosmological knowledge, an understanding of cycles of the conditions under which worlds had ended before, and of what signs in the sky and earth might indicate that such conditions were returning. The Mesopotamian tradition of the Apkallu, 7 sages, who according to Sumerian mythology were sent by Enki before the flood to teach humanity the arts of civilization, carries this logic to its most explicit form. The Apkallu are described as half human, half fish emerging from the sea to deliver knowledge and then returning to the water. After the flood, 7 more sages appear, the post-diluvian Apkallu carrying the same civilizational knowledge into the rebuilt world. The myth encodes a specific claim that the knowledge necessary for civilization was preserved through the catastrophe by beings whose specific function was its preservation, and that this preservation was deliberate, organized, and successful. Whether the Apkallu are understood as divine as human specialists mythologized over time, or as a cultural memory of actual people who perform this function, the structural claim they embody is the same: that knowledge was treated as a survival resource of the first order, as important to protect as food or water or seed. The Vedic tradition of India offers the most technically elaborate version of this preservation system in the form of the oral transmission of the Vedas themselves. The Vedic texts were maintained for thousands of years through a system of memorization so rigorous that it included not only the words of the texts, but the precise pitch of every syllable, the exact timing of every pause, and multiple redundant encoding systems, forward recitation, backward recitation, recitation in a checkerboard pattern, alternating words designed to make any corruption of the text detectable and correctable. The result is a body of oral literature that scholars believe has been preserved with extraordinary fidelity across a span of time that may exceed 3,000 years of documented transmission and possibly considerably more. The people who designed this system understood something that modern information theory would recognize, that redundancy is the primary defense against data loss, and that a message important enough to preserve across millennia requires not just one carrier, but many, not just one encoding, but several layered on top of each other, so that the failure of any single layer does not compromise the whole. The Mesoamerican day keepers, the specialists who maintained the Maya and Aztec calendrical systems, operated within a similarly rigorous framework of knowledge. Transmission, one that combined astronomical observation, mathematical calculation, and ritual performance in a system where each element reinforced the others. The long count calendar, with its nested cycles reaching back to a mythological creation date and forward to cycle boundaries thousands of years in the future, required its practitioners to hold in active memory not just the current date, but the entire framework of relationships that gave any date its meaning, its position within the solar year. The ritual calendar, the Venus cycle, the lunar series, and the great cycles whose endpoints mark the boundaries between world ages. Losing any part of that framework was not simply an intellectual inconvenience. It was in the understanding of the people who maintained it a failure with cosmological consequences, a loosening of the structure that kept track of where in the cycle of catastrophe and renewal the current world stood. What the universality of the wisdom keeper figure suggests the one who is warned, the one who carries the knowledge through the one whose survival is specifically the survival of information rather than merely of biology, is that somewhere in the deep past, the people who formulated these traditions had learned at serious cost that the loss of accumulated knowledge is a catastrophe of a different order than the loss of population. Bodies recover in generations. Knowledge once lost may not return for centuries or may not return at all. The flood destroys the city. What the flood cannot be allowed to destroy is the memory of how to build it again, and the memory of what in the sky and the earth preceded its destruction the last time. The serpent in the sky. On a clear night, far from any city, when the Milky Way is bright enough to cast faint shadows on the ground, the sky above does not look the way it looks in planetarium images or astronomy textbooks. It does not look like a field of discrete points against a black background. It looks alive, a river of diffuse light flowing from horizon to horizon, its edges ragged and uneven, its center brighter in some places than others, its overall form sinuous and elongated in a way that the human visual system, shaped by millions of years of pattern recognition processes, not as an abstract phenomenon, but as something that moves. Ancient people looking at that sky did not have the conceptual framework of stellar distances or galactic structure to organize what they saw. They had the frameworks that their nervous systems and their cultural inheritance provided. And one of those frameworks appearing independently across cultures on every inhabited continent was the serpent, vast, luminous coiling across the heavens, its body the river of stars, its movement the slow turning of the night sky through the seasons. That the Milky Way should independently acquire serpentine associations in cultures as geographically separated as ancient Egypt, pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, Aboriginal Australia, and ancient India is not in itself mysterious. The sky looks like what it looks like, and snakes are among the most ancient and deeply encoded categories in the human perceptual system. What becomes more interesting is when the serpent in these traditions is not simply a poetic description of the galaxy, but a being associated with specific catastrophic events, with floods, with fire, with the ending of world ages, and when those associations appear in the same forms across traditions that have no documented channel of communication between them. The Norse Jörmungandr encircles the world, its body coiled in the ocean depths, biting its own tail. It is not a creature of fire or air, but of water. Its very existence keeps the ocean in its place, and when it releases its tail and rises from the sea, the rising of the waters and the destruction of the world begin simultaneously. The connection between the serpent's movement and the behavior of the ocean is not metaphorical in the Norse conception, it is mechanical. The serpent is the structural principle that holds the seas at bay, and its release is the physical cause of the flood. That framing the serpent as the agent or embodiment of catastrophic inundation appears in a form strikingly similar to this in the Aboriginal Australian tradition of the rainbow serpent, which moves through the land in the dreaming carving rivers and shaping coastlines with its body, but which can also be provoked into destroying the landscape it created. sending floods across the country and swallowing those who violate sacred law. In both traditions, the serpent is not simply a symbol of danger. It is the entity whose behavior determines whether the world is habitable or destroyed, and the relationship between human conduct and serpentine response carries an urgency that feels less like theology and more like a warning encoded in the most durable narrative form available. The Egyptian Apophis Apep in its older form operates differently from the Norse and Aboriginal serpents, but preserves the same essential tension. Apophis does not cause floods. It threatens light. Each night as the solar bark carrying Ra travels through the underworld, Apophis attempts to swallow the sun to end the light permanently, to plunge the world into a darkness from which it would not recover. The priests of the Egyptian temples performed rituals nightly to assist Ra in defeating the serpent, burning wax effigies, reciting spells, doing everything within their power to tip the balance of a cosmic struggle, whose outcome was never in the Egyptian theological imagination guaranteed. The sun rose each morning not because it was inevitable, but because the serpent had been defeated again barely for another night. That framing of sunrise as a victory won, rather than a certainty given, carries an anxiety that is difficult to explain as pure theological convention. It reads more like the residue of an experience or a transmitted memory of an experience in which the sun actually did fail, in which darkness actually did descend for longer than a night, and in which the return of light was genuinely uncertain rather than cosmologically guaranteed. The Mesoamerican Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, presents the most complex version of the cosmic serpent motif, because it combines characteristics that the other traditions distribute among separate figures. Quetzalcoatl is simultaneously a creator, a civilizer, a destroyer, and a returning force whose reappearance marks the turning of a world age. He brings knowledge and calendar systems and the cultivation of maize, but he is also associated with Venus as both morning and evening star, the planet whose disappearance below the horizon and reappearance on the other side ancient Mesoamerican astronomers tracked with obsessive precision, partly because Venus's behavior was associated in their cosmological system with periods of cosmic danger times, when the boundary between world ages was thin, the conditions for catastrophe were elevated. The feathered quality of Quetzalcoatl, the combination of serpent and bird, earth and sky, in a single being has been interpreted as reflecting the appearance of a comet, the bright nucleus as the serpent's head, the spreading tail of dust and gas as feathers or wings, the whole moving across the sky in a path that would have been impossible to ignore and impossible to categorize within any existing natural framework. Whether that interpretation is correct is beyond demonstration. What it explains, at least structurally, is why the feathered serpent is associated with both celestial movement and catastrophic disruption, because a comet large enough and close enough to produce visible effects would have been experienced as both. The Indian Shesha, the cosmic serpent on whose coils the universe rests, and on whom Vishnu sleeps during the dissolution of one world age and the creation of the next, brings the motif to its most abstract formulation. Shisha is not a threat to be defeated or a force to be propitiated. It is the substrate of existence, the thing that the world rests on, and its nature as a serpent connects the imagery of cosmic structure to the imagery of coiling, of cycles, of something that bends back on itself and returns to its beginning. When Shisha uncoils at the end of a world age, it is not an attack but a release, the structure that held the current world in place, relaxing, allowing the dissolution that precedes creation, the end that makes the next beginning possible. That framing of the serpent as the principle of cyclical structure, rather than simply the agent of destruction, is perhaps the most sophisticated version of the motif, and it encodes in mythological language something that modern orbital mechanics would recognize, that the stability of a system is maintained by forces that, if they shift, produce instability of a corresponding magnitude. What the cosmic serpent traditions share across their considerable differences is an orientation toward a specific category of sky events, something that moves, that has extension, rather than being a point of light that appears where nothing was before and grows over time, that is associated in the cultural memory of multiple civilizations with the conditions under which worlds have ended. The comet is the most obvious candidate for what that experience was, and the torrid meteor stream, the debris field of a giant comet that may have been fragmenting for tens of thousands of years, and that Earth passes through twice annually, is the most specific astronomical candidate for the source of the most catastrophic encounters. Whether the serpent in the oldest accounts was always or ever a comet observed by human eyes is a question the evidence cannot definitively answer. What the evidence can support is the observation that the serpent motif across every tradition in which it appears carries the memory of something in the sky that was genuinely dangerous, and that the people who encoded it in their deepest narratives believed it was possible for that something to return what the survivors left behind. At the edge of what we can reasonably claim to know, there is a posture that honest inquiry requires, not the posture of conclusion, not the satisfaction of a mystery solved, but something quieter and more durable. It is the posture of someone who has followed a set of traces across a very large landscape and arrived not at a destination, but at a clearing from which the landscape itself becomes visible in a way it was not before. The traces we have followed in these chapters do not converge on a single point. They converge on a shape, an outline of something that may have happened, and that multiple civilizations working independently in their own languages and their own cosmological frameworks appear to have spent considerable effort trying to ensure would not be forgotten. The floods in the oldest accounts are not interchangeable with local river flooding or seasonal inundation. They are described as total as events that reduce the visible world to water, and a small number of survivors clinging to whatever height remained above the surface. The fire in the oldest accounts does not come from volcanoes or from the ground. It comes from the sky in a direction that fire had not previously come from, and it leaves behind a landscape transformed in ways that outlast the fire itself. The darkness in the oldest accounts is not metaphorical or seasonal. It is a physical condition, extended over months or years, cold descending where cold had no seasonal reason to arrive, crops failing to sare, animals disappearing, the sun behaving in ways that the people watching it found genuinely alarming rather than cyclically predictable. And the serpent coiling through the sky of so many ancient traditions carries in its body the memory of something that moved across the heavens in a way that stars and planets do not move, something that grew, that had extension and direction, that arrived and then was gone, leaving the world it passed through measurably different from the one it had found. The geological record does not prove that these accounts are memories of real events. What it does is remove the comfortable certainty that they cannot be. The younger Dryas boundary, with its nano-diamonds and its platinum anomalies and its carbonized layer, appearing at dozens of sites across 3 continents, marks a moment approximately 12,800 years ago, when something changed the planet's climate with a speed that ordinary processes do not produce. The post-glacial sea level rise drowned coastlines that had been inhabited for tens of thousands of years, consuming whatever was built along them, with a thoroughness that the ocean maintains very effectively. The Aboriginal oral traditions that have been partially verified against seafloor mapping demonstrate that human memory, under the right conditions of cultural care and ceremonial transmission, can preserve accurate geographical information across 10 millennia, which means the floor of what oral tradition is capable of preserving is considerably lower than most assumptions about ancient reliability have placed it. The monuments Göbekli Tepe on its ridge in southeastern Turkey, the pyramid complex at Giza with its cardinal alignments and its stellar shafts, the megalithic calendars of the Sahara and the British Isles, the astronomical observatories of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, suggest that the people who built them were engaged in a project that extended beyond the immediate needs of agriculture, governance, or religious practice. They were tracking cycles longer than individual lifetimes and coding observations in stone that would remain legible when the observers themselves were gone, building instruments that could function as messages to future generations about what the sky does and what its behavior might mean. The wisdom keepers who appear at the center of so many catastrophe narratives warned, prepared, carrying essential knowledge through the destruction into the world on the other side, may be the mythologized memory of actual specialists whose function was exactly what the myths describe: the preservation of the information that makes civilization possible through conditions that civilization itself cannot survive. None of this adds up to proof. The honest position after everything we have examined is that we are looking at a convergence, a gathering of independent lines of evidence from geology, archaeology, mythology, oral tradition, and archaeastronomy, each line incomplete in itself, each pointing in a broadly similar direction, without any single one being sufficient to establish the destination. The convergence is real, Whether it reflects a single catastrophic event, a series of related events spread across centuries, a set of genuinely independent disasters that human psychology and narrative tradition have assembled into a single remembered shape, or some combination of all of these, is a question the evidence as it currently stands cannot answer with finality. What the evidence can support is the observation that the question deserves to be taken seriously, more seriously perhaps than the institutional momentum of established timelines has historically allowed. The stories were told around fires that have been cold for 10,000 years, in languages that no living person speaks, by people whose names and faces are entirely beyond recovery. They were told with deliberate care, passed from elder to child, with the specific intention that the child would pass them to the next child, and so on, across a span of generations so long that the original event, if there was one, had already receded beyond the horizon of direct memory before the first written record was made. The fact that they arrived here in this form, with this degree of consistency, across this degree of separation, is itself the most durable piece of evidence we have not for what happened, but for how seriously the people who remembered it believed that the remembering mattered. The traces remain open. The stones remain standing. The seafloor remains, for the most part, unread. The clay tablet that George Smith held in the winter of 1872 is still there in the British Museum, in a room that closes at 5:30 in the afternoon. It sits behind glass smaller than most people expect, a fragment, really one piece, of a larger text that was itself a copy of something older pressed into wet clay by a hand whose owner has been dust for 4,000 years. The words on it describe a man standing at the opening to a vessel on a mountain, watching a raven fly away and not return, understanding from that single absence that the water had finally begun to yield. It is a quiet moment inside an enormous catastrophe, and the person who chose to record it, who thought that specific detail, the raven that did not come back, was worth preserving, across whatever distances of time and copying and translation lay between the original experience and the clay, understood something about memory that we are still in our own way working out. We have moved through a great deal of territory tonight. Sediment layers and seafloors, pillars carved before agriculture, oral traditions preserved across 300 generations, ice cores that hold the atmosphere of a world that no longer exists, serpents coiling through the skies of civilizations that never compared notes. The territory does not resolve into a single clean answer, and that is worth sitting with rather than hurrying past. Most of what we know about the deep past is the shape of what we do not know, the outline left behind by everything that was lost, the coastlines that the ocean covered, the libraries that burned the stories that were told for 10,000 years, and then somewhere in the long chain of transmission were not told again. History is not a record. It is a residue. What reaches us is the fraction that survived the filters of time and chance, and the particular accidents of who chose to write things down and what materials they wrote on, and whether those materials happen to be buried in dry sand rather than wet ground. The rest is silence, which is not the same as absence. It is not necessary to have resolved the question we followed tonight in order to have spent the time well. The question why so many ancient cultures remember the same world-ending event does not require an answer to do its work. Its work is the noticing, the pausing, the willingness to hold open something that the comfortable version of history would prefer to close. The ancient sky watchers who built their monuments to face specific stars were not most of them afraid of the dark. They were attentive to it. They understood that the sky is a clock running on timescales that exceed individual lives, and that the only way to read it accurately is to accept that you will not live to see the full cycle complete. You watch your portion, you record it, you pass it on, someone else watches their portion. Over enough generations the pattern becomes visible, and somewhere in the sediment below the seafloor that covers the old coastlines the pattern may still be waiting. Perhaps that is enough to carry into sleep not an answer but an opening. The sense that the world is older than the stories we tell about it, that the people who came before us were paying attention in ways we have only recently begun to recover, and that the questions they left, encoded in stone and song and sacred calendar, are still quietly addressed to us. Rest now, traveller. The tablet is still there. The raven did not return. The waters receded as they always have, and someone was standing on the mountain when they did, watching the horizon, already thinking about how to make certain this would not be forgotten. That person is why you're here. That chain of remembering, fragile, interrupted, improbable, held. It brought the story all the way to this moment, to this darkness, to the quiet, just before sleep finds you. Let the old questions settle like silt. Let the deep water hold what it holds. The morning will come the way mornings always come, not because it is guaranteed, but because so far it always has. Close your eyes. The sky above you is the same sky they watched. It has not finished its story, neither have you.